Hello, this is Martin Clarkson, a communication studies professor here at Colorado State University and the director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. This video is basically primarily kind of done for my students. It's what we do at the beginning of our facilitation training to really kind of lay out the philosophy of facilitation and what we call the key responsibilities of the deliberative facilitator. So let me share my screen here real quick. To start with, we developed kind of the idea of the deliberative facilitator as being a specific kind of facilitator, particularly for deliberative events, particularly kind of from a wicked problems perspective, which is kind of the underlining theory, in a sense, of a lot of the work that the CPD does. Now, before we jump into responsibilities, thinking a little bit about how these were developed, and three key points here. One is these responsibilities really set out a pretty active facilitator. When I was initially trained, now 15, 16 years ago, through National Issues Forum, I was actually trained to be more of a minimalist facilitator, right? The idea was a facilitator doesn't do much. The people are having the conversation. You're just there, just in case, in a sense, to kind of step in. The process is somewhat run itself. And that's where we kind of started with the CPD. But then as we were looking at the conversations, I was having conversations with my students after the events, we weren't getting the type of conversation we really wanted to. People weren't digging into the inherent tensions. People weren't they weren't deliberating the way we wanted them to deliberate. So as we kind of developed the CPD more and more, we realized we were asking our facilitators to be more and more active, right? To intervene in the conversation more. To ask people to work through issues, to surface underlining tensions and put them on the table and help them work through that in a sense. We realize there's a trade-off there, right? We realize with an active facilitator, that the facilitator has more power. They're impacting the conversation more. But that's one of the trade-offs I think that's inherent to what we need to take on. The second aspect of a deliberative facilitator is this notion that there is really a dual commitments, right? Certainly the facilitator has a commitment to the group that they're facilitating. In our case, it's normally a small group around 5 to 8 or so at a table. We have enough students that we can, 100 people show up, we can split them up into several different tables in each. But while they do have that commitment to the participants in their group, there's also a broader commitment really to the community overall, right? The idea of a deliberative forum is, those participants, yes, we want to hear from those participants. We want to respect their time. We want to, make sure that we hear their voice. But we're also asking them to do the hard work of deliberative engagement to help us as a community address our shared problems better, right? So there's another tension there that we're dealing with in a sense of how do we make sure we honor that specific group, but then how do we honor these broader commitments of trying to have the conversations and help our community. And then the third point, you've already got a sense of it already, is we see deliberation, we see facilitation very much through the lens of negotiating tensions, right? So as we go through these 10 responsibilities, a key aspect of these 10 responsibilities is they don't fit together very well. Right, that facilitators, you can't simultaneously honor all 10 of these these responsibilities. You're going to be, basically required to make some tough choices between them. And in a specific situation, which of the responsibilities is more important to you to achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve with a specific discussion, right? So we really believe the heart of facilitation is the ability to negotiate those tensions well. Right? Part of that is we very much see facilitation as an art, not a science. So we can talk about principles, we can talk about tools, but in the end, anytime a student asks me about a specific facilitation situation, I can never give them a clear answer, right? Because it always depends on different things, right? On how you want to negotiate those tensions, and in a lot of ways on your skills, right? Because it's clear that as facilitators get more and more skilled, and I think that skill has to come through reflective practice of doing it and talking about it and reflecting on it and having conversations and doing it some more. Basically what the skill set is facilitators get better and better at negotiating these tensions and potentially finding ways of transcending those tensions and honoring these responsibilities in better and better ways. All right, so let's get into these responsibilities. There's 10. I'll post in the link a little 2-page. Basically, this text is 2 pages from our workbook, and the students will be kind of looking at as that kind of go. So the first responsibility of a deliberative facilitator is to be impartial. Right? The basic notion is, facilitators shouldn't be telling their stories too much. Their opinion shouldn't be clearly part of the conversation. Right? That being said, we recognize almost every single other responsibility, at least 3 through 10, tends to violate this one. Right? It's really easy to be impartial when you don't say anything. But as soon as you intervene, as soon as you ask a question, as soon as you paraphrase, at some level, you're violating that impartiality, right? So this is the number one responsibility. It has to be kind of top of mind in a sense. For us to do the work that we want to do, the community has to trust us. They have to believe that the facilitator doesn't have a dog in the fight, right? But we also recognize that, overemphasizing kind of a pure sense of detached neutrality is not going to be enough to do what we need to do, right? The second responsibility is another one that has some deep kind of tensions with almost every single other one, right? And this goes back to the dual commitments in a way, that a facilitator does really want to honor the people in their group, right? So we do want to allow the participants to own the process and topic. We want, if they came to really kind of say something specific, we want them to have that chance to do that, right? We don't want to over-process our meetings. We don't want to over-structure our meetings and basically require everyone to talk about what we think they should talk about, right? Again, while this is a commitment and this is number 2, this should be kind of top of mind in a sense. We also recognize that with deliberative facilitation, right, we're not just there to hear their views, right? We're there as a group to help them refine their views, right? We're there to try to tap into human creativity and find better ways of doing things, and negotiating, identifying and negotiating tensions, and thinking broad. So there's a lot of other commitments there that go well beyond just hearing the opinions that people had when they walked in the door. Right? So we highlight this responsibility. It's important to us, but again, we recognize we're going to be violating it in some ways. These next 3 are kind of basic facilitation responsibilities in almost all types of facilitation, right? So clearly a big responsibility of the facilitator is to keep things on track, right? A lot of times the primary job of facilitator is kind of as a timekeeper, right? To walk people through the session, to make sure the tasks that were designed as part of the facilitation are completed, right? And we find in a lot of ways that timekeeper can be an important tool for a facilitator to get things done, right? Of recognizing, of giving time warnings, it helps kind of intervene as you need to shift the conversation because of the time and concept of it. Also, keeping things on track in terms of subject matter. You see very much a tension here between responsibility 2 and 3, right? With the potential of a tangent, right? If someone is telling a really interesting story, those can be powerful, those can be important, people feel heard. But if it's not directly related to the topic at hand, facilitators have a choice there, right? Do you see where the story goes? Potentially does it land and provide some key insight, or is it a distraction from the subject matter? So we train our facilitators to not overemphasize again the need to keep things on track in terms of subject matter. Sometimes tangents can be beautiful. Tangents can be powerful things that help us understand an aspect of the topic that we didn't anticipate beforehand, right? At the same time, tangents can take a lot of time and can take take away from a process and the quality of a process. So struggling with that tension is going to be inherent to a lot of our conversations. The fourth one is the job of the facilitator to manage the group, to make sure everyone who wants to is part of the conversation, to try to balance out the time. We certainly don't again overemphasize this in a sense of everyone should talk exactly 15% of the time or anything like that. But several interventions that facilitators may make is to try to open up the conversation, to hear from people that haven't spoken yet, to allow, to encourage dissent, to encourage pushback if there's a lot of consensus in the group. So bringing in those voices and working hard certainly to bring in voices that aren't as natural, that aren't as comfortable speaking, that aren't as used to kind of dominating conversations and important points. The ensuring no one dominates, it's one of the most often questions we get asked, like how do I deal with someone who just talks too much, in a sense, right? And I think one of the basic arguments or tactics that we talk about there, instead of focusing so much on getting that one person to not speak as much, is to focus more on getting the other people speaking, right? Have those techniques to spread the word around and just ask other people's voices to kind of step up. It's much easier to control someone who's over talking versus someone who's just talking a lot, right? But we'll get into a lot more of those strategies as we kind of go along. The second one leads to probably one of the maybe the second most asked question I have with training is when someone is sharing misinformation, how do I react to that as a facilitator, particularly as an impartial facilitator? And I'll tell you it's a very difficult question to answer, right? We're still trying to find out the best ways, in a sense. There's ways to deal with misinformation before an event. There's ways to deal with misinformation after event. How to best deal with misinformation or a self kind of identified expert who's dominating a conversation during a process is certainly a difficult one. Lots of specific tactics that we'll kind of get into. But we frame this in this way. In terms of the facilitator should not be an expert on the subject matter, right? We should be the process experts rather than the content experts. And I think that's one of the reasons why the CPD has worked actually so well, because these students they're not seen as experts. Yes, we train them on the topics. We'll provide a glossary of terms. Often we'll have experts come into class to kind of help prepare. We need to know enough about the issue to be able to direct the conversation and be able to kind of understand it and ask good questions. But the fact that we're not experts, I think, in the long run helps us, right? Because we're able to keep the conversation at a level that the general public can kind of engage in, a sense. As soon as a facilitator corrects someone on a factual kind of point, in some ways their role has changed from a facilitator to an expert. And that has some significant negative effects on their role, on their responsibilities as facilitators. So we have to be careful with that. That being said, in some cases, the misinformation or the problem that's being shared is going to so negatively impact the conversation that the facilitator needs to intervene in that way, right? So we talk about different strategies in the course about how to do that in a way that it's not you as the expert correcting them as someone had misinformation, but referring to the material that we have at the table, referring to experts in the room, calling over experts in the room. There's different ways to kind of engage that, and often the best choice might be, instead of directly engaging it, is to bracket it and kind of move on, right? If that key misinformation is not a significant thing, right? The best thing might be just to kind of move on and shift, right? But overall, the facilitator thinking about how do I deal with misinformation, how do I deal with information, how do I deal with experts at the table is a key part of fulfilling the responsibilities of a facilitator well. These next three kind of really build, and this brings out the key kind of deliberative facilitator aspect of the work. This is where we've taken students more and more, where they become more active. So this is getting beyond what I see as a basic facilitation responsibilities and more specific to a deliberative facilitator, trying to spark these deeper conversations that help us engage wicked problems well. So this first level is a key level, and I will say for the new students, these are advanced facilitation skills, so we want to talk about them now, but this is something we'll be developing throughout kind of the semester and with experience in ways. We're not expecting your first few facilitation practices to really get at this level. You'll practice a lot of the earlier responsibilities and get some experience there, and this is something that you'll slowly develop. But one key aspect of facilitating from a wicked problems perspective is being able to identify those underlying values and kind of bring those out. We don't tend to talk explicitly about values, right? We don't talk to say, well, safety is very important for me, therefore I believe we should do X, right? People make arguments for policies, for preferences that are inherently value-laden, but those values are typically implied or assumed. So one key skill of a facilitator, responsibility of a facilitator, is to bring those out, right? Often through paraphrase or through questions, to get a sense of, okay, what are the values that are really motivating people, particularly people from different perspectives. Part of this ties to Fisher and Urey's work and getting to yes of moving from positions to interests, right? Values are the underlying interest to people's positions. People's positions might be pretty intractable. There might be a lot of tension there. There might be there's not a lot of kind of common ground in both and. But when we get to the level of values and what people care about, there's often a lot of common ground. Right? So that's inherently part of that discussion. Identifying values is something that can happen before an event, during an event, and after an event as well. And so we try to do a lot of that work. So students are often prepared to anticipate, what values might come out. But again, we don't want to overemphasize that too much because new values might be expressed that we didn't anticipate beforehand. So we always want to be open to that fact of having a sense of the key values with an issue, but also always looking for new values that might come out that become part of the conversation that we need broadly to think as a community. How do we best negotiate between these values? The next step in this progression then, so first it's identifying the underlying value, identifying what people really care about, and then the second key aspect of a deliberative facilitator, particularly in our kind of polarized, kind of outraged, hyperpartisan kind of times, is helping people develop mutual understanding across perspectives, and a lot of that is working against human nature to help people see the downside of their preferred positions and see the upside of opposing positions. So a lot of this work is done with reaction questions of getting people to think deeper, of tougher questions, to asking people to imagine the people that disagree with them. What do you think is important to them? And trying to bring out opposing values that the person expressing that position might hold those values. There's just they have blinders on at that point, not seeing those values as particularly relevant. Right, so a lot of this is getting people to respond to each other. A lot of this is relying on the materials that we develop, which should have kind of a nice sense of the underlying tensions and the trade-offs that are inherent to kind of these different issues. This is particular the aspects of deliberative conversations that don't happen naturally. So facilitators often have to kind of bring this up. Right, have to push people on here to not letting your table get away with just talking past each other. Right, we don't want our conversations to be a collection of individual opinions kind of passing each other. Right, we want to engage those tensions. As I've said several times already, identify that underlying tension, put that on the table, and help people kind of work through it in a productive ways. And so this is an important aspect of it. The first thing is identifying the values. The second thing is seeing the different sides of issues and helping people kind of put their blinders on. And then the third big step of this is identify and work through those key tensions among and between their perspectives, right? Because part of a wicked problems analysis is that it's not just about us versus them. It's not my values against their values, right? That there's tensions within my own values, that there's downsides in a way. If I overemphasize the values that I care about too much, that can be a problem, right? Similar to the other material here, there's work that you can do to identify key tensions before, during, and after events. And we kind of do that work as we go through. So once again, there might be specific tensions we're anticipating and ready for, and other tensions that might come up organically through a conversation that we didn't see before, right? And that's probably one of the most advanced facilitator skills, is to be able to, through a conversation, see a connection between one participant and another participant, both making arguments, but how those arguments, rather than passing past each other, have a sense of tension that's useful to identify and explicitly help people kind of work through that in important ways. And then the last tension is kind of a catch-all in a way, right? Because one way we really see, a lot of the work of the CPD, another video, if you're interested, talks about polarity management that we'll get into later in the semester for the students. But one way I like to think about the role of the facilitator is you're balancing several different things. You're balancing these different polarities of, and hitting the target correctly, keeping it perfectly where you need to be in balance is certainly a very difficult skill, particularly because there's multiple things you're trying to balance. So the main thing that we try to teach our facilitators is not so much always seeking that perfect balance, but having the skill set to bring people back from the extremes. Right? So these three polarities in particular, between idealism and realism, or kind of strong optimism and pessimism is another way to kind of frame that one, between complexity and simplicity, and depth versus breadth. You want some balance between those. So if your table is particularly pessimistic, right, what are the interventions you can make to kind of pull them out of that and get them a little bit more towards the middle, right? If your table is very much in the weeds and just really kind of complex thinking, what are the questions you can ask that kind of elevate that a little bit and get people talking more about kind of broader concepts? Or the flip side, right? If people are just seeing things through very simple lens and attached to very simple narratives, how can you be the vehicle to kind of make it a little bit more complex for people to see things they're not seeing, to see the trade-offs, to see the other side? And then depth versus breadth is something that we're always working with, right? We teach our students, maybe you're reacting to a document that has kind of 5 key points. Not every single table is going to get through all 5 key points, right? If every table gets through 2 or 3 of those with some depth, across the room, we'll be able to have both depth and breadth. So you're always, this comes back with that question of dealing with the tangent, right? At what point do you maybe intervene to kind of move on, to shift the conversation, or would it be better at that point to really kind of dig deeper and really kind of engage the conversation? There's not a right answer to that. It depends on several different kind of other aspects and the purpose of the event. But we like to kind of train our students that at least these 3 tensions. We'll introduce quite a few others as we go. The tension between too much structure and too little structure is one, particularly for process design, but then implicates facilitators as well. Do they stick with the process even if it's not working, or do they kind of shift in important ways? And we allow our facilitators to do that as part of this context of negotiating some of these tensions, seeking that middle ground, but more importantly, again, having the skills to get people off the extremes when they focus too much on one side of that polarity. So with that, that's the kind of the 10 key aspects of 10 key responsibilities of deliberative facilitator. Like I said up from the beginning, these are important to kind of have in mind. But then most importantly, as you start getting experience with deliberative facilitation and kind of building more and more your skill set, you realize that most of the choices you make on the fly as a facilitator in the moment are making choices between these responsibilities. Sometimes prioritizing one over the others, sometimes trying to find that right balance, sometimes ideally finding a way of transcending to be able to honor kind of multiple responsibilities kind of at the same time. So with that, I appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we'll see you in other videos.